So as I said, my name's James Farrell. I'm from Community Legal Centres Queensland, and really pleased to have Beth Incognito here with us today from the Anti-Discrimination Commission of Queensland to talk about unconscious bias. Before I hand over to Beth, can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're gathered. Beth and I are in the Brisbane office of Community Legal Centres Queensland, so we acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yagara people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're from which we're broadcasting this morning, but recognise that there are people tuning in from across Queensland and actually from across Australia. So we acknowledge First Australians, elders, ancestors, emerging leaders, any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today, particularly in light of the subject matter today, unconscious bias, absolutely something that affects a number of groups across the community, as Beth will talk about, but particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Couple of housekeeping things. You should be able to see that there's a CLC webinar PowerPoint link on your control panel. That's a link to the PowerPoint that Beth has prepared and is presenting to this morning, and you should be able to download that to assist you in taking notes and everything. We'll also email a copy of that around to everyone when the presentation's finished this morning, hopefully with a link to the recording from this session as well. There are a couple of ways you can ask questions as the webinar progresses. You can press that button that looks like a hand on your control panel. You can press that button that looks like a hand on your control panel. We'll see a hand go up at our end, and we can unmute your microphone and you can ask a question through your microphone or your phone, whichever audio it is that you're using. The other way that you can ask a question is to type a question into the questions box. Someone's just done that and distracted me for a moment. I apologise for that. But you can ask a question there. We can either read it out or paraphrase it. Beth can answer it directly without you having to speak to us. I think that's the housekeeping things for us to be ticked off. Can I, on behalf of everyone who's tuning in, welcome Beth from the Anti-Discrimination Commission. She'll introduce herself, but I will flag that she's very generously agreed to present what's essentially a 4-hour face-to-face workshop in less than an hour using a webinar. So necessarily the content is going to be a little bit less deep than we might get from that workshop, but it's a really important subject and one that where we should all understand and acknowledge some of the subjective ideas or views that we bring to our work in community legal centres, and how we might be able to make sure that our services are offered in a more accessible and appropriate way, recognising those backgrounds from which we come and the ideas that we bring with us. So with that, let me hand over to Beth with thanks as we talk about unconscious bias.
Okay, good morning everyone and welcome. So as already mentioned, my name is Beth. You may have noticed that my name is Beth Incognito. Before we go any further, yes, that is my real name. No, I didn't change it to that. And I do generally think it's pretty cool, except for when it occasionally gets me into trouble when people don't think I'm real. My background's actually in psychology, and I developed the 4-hour face-to-face course that we do on unconscious bias. So I'll just go to the next slide. This is my first time delivering a webinar too, so I apologise. I'm a little bit uncertain on how to run the program. Okie dokie. As mentioned, this is just a bit of a crash course. Won't be going into anywhere near as much depth as I usually do. Now I've already done the next slide. I just realised. There we go. And there's a picture of me, so you've got a face to go with the name. All right. So before we go into any of the content, just a little bit of a disclaimer. We all have unconscious knowledge and unconscious associations. It's just a byproduct of how our brains work. There are things that we know that we don't even realise we know, and these things can influence us unconsciously. Now, don't feel bad that you might have some unconscious bias. We don't want to think of ourselves as biased people, and it can be confronting to think that we might be. Far better that we look at this as just something that our brain does, but that by knowing about it, we can actually choose what to do with that unconscious knowledge, whether we let it influence us or not. So it's actually really neat. We have the opportunity to take control back over our unconscious. Knowledge is power, so don't feel bad, be excited. So what we're going to talk about today, I'll briefly give you a definition of what unconscious bias is. Then we'll talk a little bit around what some problems that our brain faces, some challenges that we have that result in us using shortcuts just to be able to get through the day and function in the world. And that's part of where unconscious bias comes into play, through these mental shortcuts that we use. We'll talk about where we learn our unconscious biases. Where do we get this knowledge that is then influencing us unconsciously? We'll talk about some unconscious bias hotspots, times to be really aware of the potential for unconscious bias to influence us inappropriately so that we can really look out for it. And most of sort of the second half, we'll be talking about just a few strategies that we can use to manage unconscious bias. Now, again, there are more out there. I've got some recommended reading at the end of this presentation. I do encourage you to go and seek to learn a little bit more deeply about this, but still will give you a bit of an idea of what unconscious bias is and what we're talking about. Looks like we've got a question. No question? Okay, let's keep going then. So in order to explain what unconscious bias is, it might be easy if I explain what the opposite is, explicit bias or explicit prejudice. That's those attitudes and opinions and ideas that we have that we know that we feel that way. We're aware of that attitude and we consciously endorse it. So for example, you'll see during State of Origin time, a lot of people very happy to express their opinion on the other team. That would be explicit or conscious bias or prejudice. Unconscious bias is all of the unconscious knowledge and things that we've learned, experiences we've had, information that's stored in our brain that actually influences how we perceive people, decisions we make about people without us even realizing. So for example, if we have sort of unconscious assumptions that women are more interested in sort of makeup and beauty and men are more interested in tools and handyman type activities, then if we're hiring for either of those positions, we might automatically picture a woman in the role of the beautician we're seeking to hire and a man in the role of a handyman. And that's then going to influence how we advertise the position, who we consider interviewing, and who we eventually recruit. So unconscious bias is the bias that we don't even know we're exhibiting. So why does this happen? Well, our brains have a whole lot to deal with. I'm going to show you a neat little example, just really basically as far as our visual perception and how our brain deals with that. So if you look at this checkerboard on your screen, you'll see squares A and B. Now to look at them, just notice within yourself, do they appear to be the same colour? To me, they certainly don't. Square A looks like a dark square and square B looks like a light square. But if we take out the context, turns out that they are actually the same colour, but our brain is looking at the whole picture, taking into account the shadow being cast by the cylinder, the fact that there's a pattern there, and coming to an incorrect conclusion that they must be different colours, which, as you can see in this animation, they're not. Now, our brain does that with not just visual perception, but everything that we judge and assess, decisions that we make. If we had to consciously process every bit of information that comes through to us during the day, we would not be able to cope. So there are certain key problems that our brain faces that we use shortcuts to get around so that we can actually function. So first up, there's way too much information coming at us all the time. Purely from sensory perception, we're getting around 11 million bits of information per second through what we're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, temperature, feel of our clothes on our skin. That's a ridiculous amount of information. We can't deal with all of it, so our brain just processes it in the background, filters out anything it doesn't consider useful, and just kind of, spits out a best guess answer of how the world is. At the same time as we have too much information, we don't get enough meaningful information. Whenever we're making a decision about things, perceiving things, we don't get all of the information that's useful, and then we filter half of it out anyway. So we end up filling in gaps a lot of the time with other information that we may assume to be true, things that we've learned before. So we're often connecting dots that not necessarily correctly to make up for that challenge of there not being enough meaningful information that's coming in. So that's another challenge our brain faces. We also need to make quick decisions. Often we'll be in a situation where maybe we're in danger or we might be in danger, or just even in the workplace or in day-to-day life, we don't have the luxury of sitting around consciously analysing every bit of information, questioning what the different options are. We need to make a decision quickly, despite the limited information that we have. So again, we use shortcuts to get around that. And finally, sort of the fourth main challenge that our brain faces is we can only remember so much information, and so we can only draw on so much information that we have stored in our brain. So we tend to use generalizations to store, information a bit more efficiently. They save brain space, which, as you can imagine, I'm sure means that we're often, again, making incorrect assumptions about things. Hopefully everyone's still with me so far. I realise I'm kind of rushing through this. Now, to look at this image here, I don't expect you to be able to read the details, but it might just give you a bit of an idea. If you see around the outside, we've got these four sort of general challenges, right? Then broken down further into more specific ways those challenges manifest. Now, every single one of these tiny little points around that circle towards the middle are different mental shortcuts and cognitive errors that we face. Mental shortcuts that we use that result in different specific mistakes of thinking that we make all the time, right? Hopefully you can see from looking at that, there are tons of these. Advertising executives love these cognitive errors because they make it very easy to convince us to buy stuff we don't need, right? So our brain is very efficient. We're able to, deal with the massive amount of information and having to make quick decisions. We use these shortcuts that allow us to do that. But the trade-off of that is we often make a lot of very slightly wrong choices and decisions about things. So there's a few different names for the way this is sort of set up. It's the dual process system of thinking, right? So fast thinking and slow thinking, system 1 and system 2 thinking. Basically, we have our fast or system 1 thinking. That is our automatic, autopilot kind of go-to, intuitive, really, really instant thinking system. That's the one that we're using most of the time. It's our autopilot that just kind of scans the environment, points out anything to us that our brain thinks we need to pay attention to, just sort of makes assumptions in the background and spits out an answer. That's what we're using most of the time, as I said. YZRD that you might see down the bottom there, that just stands for what you see is all there is. If I asked you what is 1 + 1, most of you, I imagine, would have had an answer just pop into your head without going looking for it. That would be system 1 thinking. Then we have system 2 or slow thinking. That's when we're actually thinking about things. We're, putting in effort into it, really considering it. It is a lot slower and it's kind of lazy. A nicer way to put it is that our brains like to be efficient. So we'll use system 1 whenever we can get away with it and try to avoid using system 2. We can also only do one system 2 task at a time. Turns out multitasking is actually a myth. We're actually just very, very rapidly switching between tasks. So system 2, if I asked you what is 916 multiplied by 37, most of you, I imagine, would need to use system 2 thinking. Right? So system 1 thinking is where our very, very instant, rapid sort of judgments and decisions happen, and that's where we make all of these errors that come about by using our shortcuts that allow us to manage the world that we live in and be able to move through it. Hopefully that makes some sense. So now that you have a little bit of an idea of how we use shortcuts, as I said, again, very, very surface level, I do apologise for that, where do we actually learn this information, these generalisations, all of this stuff in the background that's influencing us inappropriately? Well, culture is one big source, so that can be our communities, the ideas that we're brought up with in our family. I know I've spoken to many people who've come up to me after a session and said, oh, I've just realised this idea that I've had for forever. It's just what my dad thought, you know, and I never really questioned it. So we learn from our families, our communities. The media also is a huge source of where we learn this information from through what we're being exposed to, and not just in the news, but also through, excuse me again, you know, so television, you know, TV shows, fiction, right, movies, where the sort of examples that we're seeing of different people there, that influences us too. And it's worth noting that the stereotypes that we learn about just through hearing about them in our communities, knowing those stereotypes can actually lead to them influencing us unconsciously, even if we don't consciously endorse them, right? So knowing, you know, that there is this stereotype of, you know, French people with their berets and mustaches and ha 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 kind of laugh, that might come to mind when you meet someone and they say that they're French, because it's stored in your brain, so it can be activated when you're exposed to something that can trigger it. So culture is one place that we learn these unconscious associations. Experiences are another one. So our experiences, the experiences of people around us that they've told us about, or even seeing people have experiences, again, on TV, things like that. Think about it. If you know, you're a kid, you touch a hot stove, you touch one, and you already know, I'm not going to go around touching hot stoves. You don't need to touch multiple hot stoves to learn not to touch them. We take one experience and we can then apply that very, very generally. So for example, when someone has a negative experience with a member of a particular group, especially one they don't interact with very often, they can then apply that experience to the whole group. So if you were, say, mugged by a really ridiculously tall person, the next time you see someone who's really, really ridiculously tall, you might feel anxiety, you might want to avoid them, or you might be biased against them and assume that they're some sort of, you know, violent criminal, right? Because we've over-applied and overgeneralized an experience that we've had. There's also in-group, out-group factors. So we all have in-groups, right? So those are the groups that we're a member of. So you know, nationality-wise, my in-group would be I'm Australian. I might also have the in-group of, you know, woman, I'm female. You know, maybe you have in-groups around sort of subcultures and interests. So maybe, you know, you're a massive Doctor Who fan, or you support a particular sporting team. Other people who are in that same group, they're in your in-group. And we treat people differently when they're in our in-groups compared to when they're in our out-groups, which is those of us who aren't in our groups. It's quite interesting. We see our own groups as being made up of all special snowflakes, everyone's an individual, but we see out groups as being made up of all the same type of people. They're all very homogenous, everyone's the same in the out group, which makes it very easy to overgeneralize. And also, I'm sure it's not surprising that we give preferential treatment to people in our in-group. You know, if you assign people to different groups completely arbitrarily, just like get them to pull numbers out of a hat, they'll still show preferential favourable treatment towards the people in their own groups. It's really, really ingrained. So when do we need to be looking out for unconscious bias? When, you know, when's it in particular, given it seems like it's kind of all over the place, when do we really need to be worried about our own unconscious knowledge influencing us? Well, anytime we're making a decision about someone, there's the risk of shortcuts and unconscious knowledge influencing us. And also, anytime we're interacting with someone. So think about when you're meeting customers, or when you're, being introduced to friends of friends. Anytime you're meeting someone, we immediately notice certain characteristics about them, such as age, race, and gender. We notice in milliseconds, and we apply what we know about those groups. It gives us some information around, you know, how we should expect them to behave, how we think we should behave. It saves time, but we do overgeneralize. So anytime we're making decisions about people or interacting with people, which basically, anytime that we're having anything to do with another human, there's the risk of unconscious bias playing a role. But to apply it more specifically to the workplace, here's just a few examples, and it is just a wall of text, but I think that really highlights it's any time that we're interacting with people or making decisions about them, We need to be aware of how our unconscious knowledge and the assumptions we're making can make us treat people differently. Recruitment's one people often immediately think of, but even things like, during meetings, is everyone given the opportunity to speak? Different people all have different comfort levels with, speaking up or not. Who gets mentored, who doesn't? How are the performance reviews worded? Who gets promotional choices? Task allocation is a big one as well. Who are you giving what sorts of tasks to, and making assumptions about who will be interested in what sorts of jobs and who you think will be good at those sorts of jobs. Okie dokie. So into probably what you're here for, the what can we do about it? Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. Now again, this is, just a bit of a snapshot of a sort of in general, the sorts of strategies you can use. There are far more specific ones that I unfortunately don't have time to go into today, but you can do more reading. As I said, there's some recommended reading at the end. Excuse me, there's plenty of information on the internet. If you do a Google search, you'll find lots of really cool stuff. And if you're interested, there's also our 4-hour course that you can do. Okay, so the sort of general themes for what you can do around managing unconscious bias, first up, is slow down your thinking. Because remember, when we're using our System 1 fast thinking, that's when these shortcuts are going to be, firing the most rapidly. Anytime we're making snap judgments about things, anytime you have a gut feeling, right? A gut feeling is always an indication that there's something unconscious going on. Now, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. If you're walking down the street late at night and you suddenly have a gut feeling that maybe you need to go into a shop where there are other people, there's a good chance that maybe you've unconsciously noticed that someone's been following you for the last however many blocks, right? So I'm not saying that you need to completely never pay attention to gut feelings, but just it means you need to question what's going on and actually slow down and consciously think about what's happening. Don't let your automatic thinking run the show. So one way to do that, or one thing to be aware of, is be really, really skeptical of your own objectivity. Turns out we're really bad at being objective. Ironically, when people are extra confident of their objectivity, they're more likely to fall back onto shortcuts. So it's like, oh, I don't need to, really worry too much about this. I know I'm really objective. So then you just, you relax and fall back into System 1 thinking, and all of your unconscious knowledge can come into play. One really fascinating example of this was with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. They actually had identified that there was only about 10% of the orchestra were women, and they wanted to increase the number of women in the orchestra. So they tried all kinds of different initiatives. They had extra auditions for women, they had incentives for women to apply and come and try out, and it wasn't working. And the auditors insisted that they were being absolutely objective. In fact, they were worried that they might be biased against men because they were so bent on getting more women into the orchestra. But it just wasn't working. And they said, well, there's just this playing style that we're looking for in particular, and it just seems to be the case that women are less likely to play with that playing style. It seems to be that men are more likely to be the ones that have that playing style. And someone had the idea to try out blind auditions. So at first they put up a screen, and that didn't achieve much. They didn't see any increase in the number of women in the orchestra until someone realised that you could still hear who was coming in to play. You could hear whether they were wearing high heels or, flat shoes, the heaviness of the footsteps. So you still could form a bit of a mental picture of the gender of the musician. After that, somebody thought a little bit harder and they put down really heavy carpet. So now that information was taken out as well. Now the only thing the assessors could hear was the playing. After that, female representation increased to 45%. Now the takeaway from that story is that the assessors were absolutely convinced of their objectivity. So convinced, as I said, they were worried about going too far in the opposite direction. Now, perhaps because they were convinced of their objectivity, that made them a bit too relaxed and a bit too reliant on their automatic thinking, which was influencing how they heard the music. Another thing you can do to help with slowing down your thinking, and I know, this is easier said than done, but if you can identify any sources of stress in the decision-making environment, do what you can to remove or minimize those. Similarly, try not to be making decisions, especially not important decisions, while you're also performing another strenuous mental task. In both of these circumstances, when your mind's already busy with something else or when it's under a lot of stress, you're way more likely to fall back on shortcuts. Excuse me. And it makes sense that you would. It's your brain doing its best to be efficient and manage the workload. So any stress you can remove from the environment, try not to do too many things at once while you're making decisions, and also avoiding making decisions if you can. Avoid making decisions in a really heightened emotional state, either positive or negative, because again, you're more likely to fall back on shortcuts in those situations. Okay, other things you can do, and this is related to thinking more slowly, but actively think about counter positions to the one that's sort of come to mind. So, going way back to that image I showed in one of the very first slides, let's say we're hiring a handy person, and in our mental generalizations, through what we've seen, what we've experienced, what we grew up with, what people have told us about, we have, mental associations of people fixing things and using tools being more likely to be men, and those ideas go together in our head, and that image doesn't go so much together with women. So now we're needing to hire a handy person. First thing that's going to come to mind is we're going to picture a man. Without even, trying to, that's just who we're going to picture. If I asked you to picture a handy person, I'm sure most people automatically would picture a man. So in this circumstance, we're actively picturing the opposite. So we're picturing, this woman who is super skilled with tools, absolute whiz with, carpentry and making stuff, and they can fix anything. Whatever our assumption is, we're actively thinking the opposite and considering alternative positions. If you're in a group or in a panel, it might even be worthwhile assigning someone to be a devil's advocate. There's also the 6 thinking hats sort of idea, where different people will ask different questions and present sort of the counter. Okay, but what about this? And so really trying to challenge that assumption by presenting the opposite view. Other things to be aware of within your workplace, I'd say you need to, within your workplace and also within yourself, building awareness of unconscious bias. So obviously if it's unconscious, there's not much we can do about it. Excuse me. So it needs to be raised to the conscious level. We need to know that all of this stuff in our brain that's just stored there that we've picked up throughout the course of our life, all the ideas we've been marinating in, we need to know that those influence us so that we can actually take control back and make a conscious decision about whether we're going to be influenced by that old information in our brain or whether we're going to make a conscious choice about who we're going to hire or who we're going to promote, whose opinion we're going to take seriously, who we're going to trust. So there's various ways to do this. You can do various courses. I mean, right now you're sitting in and getting a very brief kind of explanation. That's a start. You could do other courses, just beginning to reflect on your own mental processes and observe what's going on, to sort of build your insight and awareness. There's reading that you can do, so doing research and reading some of the huge amount of material that's out there. There are implicit associations tests online, and what that is it's actually a test that you can do sitting at your computer to examine what unconscious associations and unconscious knowledge you might have, and maybe sort of unconscious feelings that you might have towards different groups. Maybe you're a bit, you feel if you were, say, a white person, you might have a preference for people who are white and display more positivity to people who are white for various reasons that we've discussed. But implicit associations tests, you can actually, excuse me, get online and do a test that'll give you an idea of what's going on in your unconscious mind. So building awareness is, an important first step. Let me just see where we're up to. Okie dokie. I have absolutely raced through this, so we're going to have heaps of time for questions, and I might even have to tell some more stories. All right. Another thing that's very important when we're looking at unconscious bias is around looking at all of your organisational policies and practices, examining whether they are actually genuinely inclusive or whether your policies, by their very nature, make assumptions or exclude people. What's the language included in there? Does it consider different backgrounds and experiences and needs that different people might have? And look at your policies across, the entire employment life cycle, and also, how you deal with the public, things like that. And possibly consider updating those policies. Also looking at your practices around, how you make decisions about people in the workplace, concessions or initiatives that you might have to support people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Consider flexible work arrangements. Excuse me, they're a really important part of being genuinely inclusive. Some interesting research has actually shown that flexible work arrangements, for example, quite a few workplaces are trialling making that the default, that everybody can access flexible work rather than it being something that you have to seek out and negotiate. Because what's being found is that when it is something you have to negotiate and ask for, men are actually discriminated against. They have a much harder time accessing those flexible work arrangements when, say, they want to have a better work-life balance or take on more caring responsibilities with their children. There's an attitude of, oh no, that's for the women. So there's stigma around having flexible work arrangements as well. And when that arrangement is available to everyone, that stigma is removed. And turns out it's way better for all of the staff, and they're happier and they perform better. So the workplace gets more productivity out of everyone as well. So everyone wins. Okay. I managed to get through all of that in half an hour. I do apologise. Hopefully you've got lots of questions. So today I've given you a very brief sort of definition of what unconscious bias is. We've talked very briefly around the idea of mental shortcuts. Maybe if you're interested, I can tell you about some specific ones that you can look out for. We've learned a little bit about, where we get these ideas from in the first place, which I'm sure none of that was particularly surprising to you. Talked a little bit about hotspots, when we need to really be aware that unconscious bias might be influencing our decisions, and very generally, sort of general ballpark strategies for managing our unconscious bias. Now, I'm going to go forward a bit and then go back. We're about to have question time, but as you can see here, I do have some recommended reading. Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, the second from the bottom, that's a really good one just on mental shortcuts in general. I think it's quite conversational and easy to read. The one above it is also really good in applying sort of those mental shortcuts specifically to unconscious bias. All of those are useful readings. And this last link down the bottom, implicit.harvard.edu, that's actually where you can go and try out some implicit associations tests yourself and have a crack. It's completely free. If you do go and try those out though, again, try to be gentle with yourself. Don't beat yourself up about your result. It's a product of what we've been exposed to, what we've learned, and knowing that you have those unconscious associations means you can now make a choice to begin challenging them and not letting it influence you. So to go back, let's open the floor for questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Beth. World record time there for such a huge amount of information, so thank you. I know there will be questions. A reminder, folks, that there are two ways that you can ask questions. You can type a question into the questions box on your control panel, or you can press that button that looks like a hand. We'll see your hand pop up and we'll unmute your microphone. I might take the prerogative I have with the microphone in front of me and kick things off. Beth, a lot of your focus was, as is the role of the Commission, on these practices in the workplace. I wonder how we translate some of those ideas, or the extent to which they even need to be translated, when we're talking about a large part of our audience, lawyers, social workers, financial counsellors, other people in a community legal centre, who see a client wheel in or walk in and looking a particular way. Are there slightly different things that we should be thinking about in terms of strategies to deal with implicit bias when we're talking about responding to a client that we might only see once or we might continue to provide ongoing services for? Is there much difference in the way that we frame that kind of thinking, or those strategies, from the way that we frame workplace practices?
Thank you for that. That's a really good question. At the end of the day, you know, it's the same sort of mental processes that are happening around assumptions that we're going to make. You know, maybe somebody comes in and, you know, we've had experiences before with people who look like this, you know, maybe being difficult to work with, or, you know, we might have that kind of like, oh, sort of response, that sort of thing. Absolutely something that happens to all of us, you know. As I said, it's how our brain works. We form these assumptions. One strategy that you can use around this sort of thing, and it's one that I use personally, is called stereotype replacement, and it falls into the sort of awareness, getting sort of more insight into your own mental processes realm. So what you would do with this, it's really just about noticing and beginning to look for and notice when we have these reactions. Because once we know that it's happening, then we can make a choice about whether it influences us. Because think about it, if we don't notice that it's happened, somebody comes in and we have this, and we're immediately colder, you know, we might try and rush through the interaction, we might be less likely to be helpful towards them. If we don't realise that's what we're doing, that we're feeling irritated because of an assumption we've made based on someone similar in the past, then we can't, you know, choose not to act that way. So stereotype replacement is just around observing our own behaviours and noticing when we have a response based on some sort of stereotype or assumption or association or past experience, noticing it, just identifying it as like, oh, you know, I'm reacting this way based on this stereotype or this assumption. Why did that happen? Right, it's because of that previous experience. What can I do to avoid it in future? I recommend doing this kind of with the attitude of a compassionate scientific observer, rather than sort of beating yourself up and going, oh, I'm a terrible person, going, oh, wow, my brain just did that. Isn't that interesting? How do I avoid that? So that's one first step, you know, just noticing it, becoming aware of it. One place I do this is when I get on the train or the bus, and you might notice, you know, you get on during peak hour, there's no seats, completely vacant, you have to choose where to sit, who you're going to sit next to, and you'll automatically immediately dismiss certain people like, nope, 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 and just to stop and go, wait, why not them? Why am I deciding I don't want to sit next to them? What's the assumption there? And just looking for it and becoming mindful. Another strategy that you can use in advance, if you know that you have a certain assumption about particular types of people, is called counter-stereotypic imaging. And what that's around is when you know you have this stereotype or assumption that goes with a particular type of person, having a mental image ready to go, an example of someone who's the opposite. So if you had a stereotype, unfortunately this is one that some people do have, of say black people being less intelligent, right? Then you might have a famous example that's someone you bring to mind. So maybe you'll think of Barack Obama, or maybe you'll picture Neil deGrasse Tyson, if you've heard of him. He's an astrophysicist, very, very charismatic, great presenter, totally awesome dude. So you'll have them in your mind, or maybe it's an abstract version. You'll just generate and have ready to go this really super smart black person, that's in your head to picture. Or maybe it's a personal example. Maybe you have a friend who's black and they're, super smart. So that's the mental image you bring to mind. One of the mental shortcuts that we use is around what's easily available, what comes to mind easily, what we've seen most often. So if you have a counter-stereotypic example sort of there, ready to go, already prepared, that makes it easier to bring that to mind and challenge that stereotype's validity. So there's a couple of examples of strategies there. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful to start with. Yep, okay, so we've got another question here. Do you have an example of where you have influenced a change in workplace practice through altering or making people aware of their unconscious bias? I think the only challenge is thinking of really specific examples. Let me think. I know that I've definitely seen examples. Okay, I've got one. I was delivering the full-length course to some executives in a department of the Queensland government, and the Deputy Director General actually came up to me at the after the session and said, holy heck, I've just realised, we have these 5 or 6 staff that sort of, lower level staff, and they all have various disabilities. And they've been here for years and years and years and years and years. And we've just made sure through the various changes of government that they didn't lose their jobs. And we thought that that was enough, that we'd done right by them just by making sure they didn't lose their jobs. And he said, I've only just even become aware that we've never considered that they might have, interest in any sort of professional development or career development. We never offer them any extra projects or extra work because we don't want to, put pressure on them. We've never even considered that they might have other skills or interests or abilities or the desire to move up from like an AO2 level position. And as soon as I get out of here, I'm going to go down and see what we can do about that. And I'm not sure what the exact initiative that's come out of that is, but I do know that that awareness led to him wanting to go and change what they were doing around those particular staff members. And at the very least, I imagine in future, he's going to be less likely to just assume that people are happy where they are in their AO2 position and, don't want to put too much pressure on them because they have disabilities. So hopefully that example's adequate. Yeah, treating people as individuals is basically what you want to do. The whole idea of unconscious bias happens because we make these generalizations, right? That our brain, just using shortcuts, applies a group-based evaluation to individuals. Wherever we can be seeing people as genuinely individuals with their entire whole individual story, experiences, everything else, and not make assumptions based on groups, then that's where we can start to minimize treating people differently because of assumptions that we make. Okay, I've got another question here. How do you get other people to look at their unconscious bias if this process ends up challenging their worldview in a major way and so are scared to go there and analyse their assumptions, etc.? Yeah, that is a really good question, and it is something that, that you do see, that people don't want to consider that maybe, first up, we don't want to realise how much we're living on autopilot, that we're not, constantly making conscious decisions about what we're doing in the world, that a lot of the time we're just doing things without thinking about it. And there are some really interesting studies that I could tell you about that show just how much, even important decisions we just do on autopilot without thinking about it. And people can find that confronting. And especially when we're talking about something like prejudice or bias, I've definitely come across people in workshops who are incredibly resistant, they're incredibly defensive. And so it can be easier for some people to just dismiss the whole idea, reject it, just go, nope, it's all stupid, I don't want anything to do with it, rather than begin to actually, go through the process of looking at, your own mental processes and considering that, oh, maybe actually I do treat people differently. At the end of the day, you can't get through to everyone, and that's a sad truth. You need to sort of pick your battles. But one thing I would suggest is wherever possible, being gentle, reminding people that it doesn't mean you're a bad person. You don't have to change everything immediately. You don't have to question everything that's going in your brain. These things it does take time to change, our processes, to make the unconscious conscious. But one of the most important things, I think, is just to be compassionate in explaining it, that, it's how our brains work. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. Because I think that's where a lot of the rejection of these ideas comes from, is the fear that, this makes me a bad person if I do have these assumptions. So trying to remove that. You've also got the issue, where sometimes the bias isn't completely unconscious, where it is actually something that someone consciously agrees with. I'd say in some ways that's even harder to challenge and challenge people's worldviews as far as that goes. And again, the way to do it is just to be very, very gentle. Quite challenging, I realise, but anytime you've kind of come up to someone and sort of said you're wrong and your idea is wrong, it's pretty much game over. So what I do is I try to meet people where they're at. Say if someone presents a view that is based on a stereotype, and I know based on statistics and facts that it's incorrect, but that's what they believe, and as far as they're concerned, that is their reality. So what I will do is I'll go to where they are and kind of go, okay, so this is your experience, this is how you see that. What about this scenario? What would happen if this alternative situation happened? So, for example, I had someone in a training session just on discrimination law at one point sort of suggest to me that having lived in the Northern Territory at one point, they believed that any Aboriginal Australians who rented a property would immediately take all the doors off and burn them. Now, it's a really strange idea. I'm not sure exactly where they got that from, but that was what they believed. And so they said that they would never, ever, ever rent a house to someone who was Aboriginal, which is pretty horrifying. And so, I was like, okay, well, that's the experience you had. What would you do if, somebody in Brisbane, they're a lawyer working for a very reputable firm, they rock up to inspect your rental property wearing a great suit, they make really great money, perfect tenant history. Would you still refuse to rent to them if they happened to be of Aboriginal descent? Unfortunately, this guy, was so bent in his ways that he said, yeah, right. So you can't always win people over, but that sort of strategy a lot of the time I do find just sort of gently questioning, presenting different opinions, different scenarios, and sort of just getting people to start examining and questioning. But I would say in general, hopefully this has been very long-winded, but hopefully it's an answer, I guess, gently is the way to get people to look at their unconscious biases and their biases in general, very gently. Any other questions do we see? Just clearing those ones. Looking for any. There's still so much stigma, bias, assumptions around clients with mental illness. How can we overcome this stigma? Yeah, that is again, a huge area that we see. And I was actually, before I was working in this role, I worked in mental health support. So I've seen how much stigma there is. Now that is a challenging area, and a lot of people do have a lot of very incorrect assumptions. I guess there's the big sort of picture ball game where we need to sort of change sort of perceptions in the media and what's in the news and the sort of general ideas out in the community. Positive and empathetic representations of people with mental illness in the media would be a great step. Maybe not only reporting the bad news stories would be great. But I think one thing that I personally think more people need to be aware of that really helps to challenge that is, statistically speaking, roughly half of all Australians will experience mental illness of some description in their lifetime, right? The lifetime prevalence of mental illness in Australia is roughly 1 in 2. So that means every single person here is either going to have an experience of mental illness themselves or love someone who has an experience of mental illness. And I think the more we can make people aware that it is so common and such a part of modern life, that it is, you know, we're talking about their experiences, the experiences of their families, people they love, that it's not what we see in the media of, you know, this person who, you know, can't cope and they're a total mess. It's a very, sadly, common and normal experience. I think that can help to change it, but I also think really as more people sort of speak out about their own experiences and share that, again, how common it is, you know, as more people find that actually I know all of these people who've, you know, had an episode of depression or similar, and can go, well, you know, my friend, you know, they've been depressed, and obviously I don't think that they're this mental image that I might have of someone with mental illness being incredibly fragile or volatile or unreliable or whatever the idea is, that will start to break it down. It is going to take a long time, unfortunately, I think, for that to completely be removed, that stigma. Hopefully that's some sort of answer for you. Any more questions? I don't know how to drive the software, so I don't know how to tell whether there are any more questions. I apologise. You're welcome. All right, I'm going to hand the mic back.
Terrific. Beth, on behalf of the people clapping and cheering wildly at their computers across Queensland, across Australia, can I thank you for a really concise and thoughtful summary of a really important area for us to understand in our everyday practice in community legal centres. We'll email around a copy of Beth's PowerPoint presentation, hopefully a copy of the recording, and links to the Anti-Discrimination Commission's unconscious bias training and the rest of its training program. So if you are interested in exploring this stuff in a little bit more depth, you'll be able to learn more. We're seeing some fantastic messages of thanks come through from you guys as well. So clearly Beth has made a bit of an impact here today. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We look forward to speaking to you soon. Have a great day.